The blindfold was yanked tight across his eyes, plunging him into darkness. The crosshairs locked onto his chest, and as the countdown thundered to 0, a deafening volley of rifles ripped through the chamber. Mikal Mahdi had just become the first man executed by firing squad in America in more than 15 years. But what unfolded wasn't a clean, clinical execution. Witnesses recoiled as he cried out, his body convulsing, gasping desperately for air as the bullets tore into him. Instead of swift justice, the scene devolved into a chilling spectacle, one that left hardened observers shaken to their core. This is the shocking story of Mikal Mahdi, the convicted killer whose brutal end reignited America's darkest debate. Mikal Mahdi was born in South Carolina in the early 1980s into a household where chaos was the norm. His childhood was scarred by poverty, constant arguments, and an absence of stability. Teachers recalled a boy who rarely smiled and often lashed out when provoked. By the time he was a teenager, he was already spiraling, dabbling in drugs, stealing from neighbors, and running with rough crowds. Police knew his name long before the murder, arresting him for fights, break-ins, and reckless behavior. Friends described him as a ticking time bomb, unpredictable, volatile, a young man with a hair-trigger temper and an aura of danger that made people uneasy. This wasn't just a troubled kid, it was the making of someone who would one day shock an entire state with an act of cold-blooded violence. In 2004, at just 21 years old, Mahdi's rage finally boiled over. On a sweltering summer night in Columbia, South Carolina, he stalked Officer James Myers, a decorated lawman who had crossed him before during earlier arrests and confrontations. Myers had written reports, testified against him in court, and become a symbol of the system Mahdi despised. Friends later claimed Mahdi felt targeted, singled out by Myers, and he began nursing a deep grudge. That grudge turned lethal when Mahdi set his sights on revenge. According to investigators, Mahdi set a trap, luring Myers into an isolated stretch under the pretense of a routine encounter. Then, in a flash, he pulled a handgun and unleashed a storm of bullets. Myers was hit again and again, his service weapon never even leaving its holster. Neighbors later described hearing the rapid gunfire echo through the night, followed by an eerie silence broken only by frantic radio calls. Prosecutors would call it a cold-blooded ambush, the kind of calculated violence that shook an entire city and painted Mahdi not as a troubled young man, but as a ruthless killer who had declared war on law enforcement itself. The murder sent shockwaves through the city. A massive manhunt was launched, with helicopters scouring the countryside and roadblocks thrown up across South Carolina. For days, Mahdi evaded capture, hiding in wooded areas and abandoned houses. But his luck ran out when officers cornered him near a highway overpass. Still armed and unremorseful, he surrendered only after being surrounded. The trial that followed was swift and devastating. Prosecutors laid out ballistics evidence, eyewitness testimony, and forensic details showing Mahdi's guilt beyond doubt. They portrayed him as a ruthless killer with no regard for human life, while the defense struggled to argue against the overwhelming evidence. Family members of Officer Myers filled the courtroom, their grief heavy in the air. After just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Mahdi was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. For nearly 2 decades, Mikal Mahdi languished on South Carolina's death row. 2 long decades of steel bars, concrete walls, and the shadow of death hanging over him. The monotony of isolation gnawed at him. Weeks blurred into months as he sat in a tiny cell with little more than a cot and a Bible. Guards remembered flare-ups, Mahdi shouting at staff, lashing out at fellow inmates, once even getting into a violent altercation that left him bruised and restrained. Other times he sank into silence, refusing meals, staring at the walls for hours as if locked in battle with his own mind. He filed appeal after appeal, arguing that his lawyers had failed him, that the system had stacked the deck against him, that he hadn't been given a fair shot. Each time the court slammed the door shut, every denial pushed him closer to the inevitable, fueling both his defiance and the growing spectacle of a killer who knew exactly how his story would end. Meanwhile, his case drew national attention for another, more sensational reason. South Carolina hadn't executed anyone since 2011, and years of botched lethal injection protocols and legal battles had left the state desperate for an alternative. Their shocking answer: dust off the firing squad. A method that felt ripped from a history book, brutal, primitive, and virtually unseen in modern America. The announcement alone stirred outrage, fascination, and morbid curiosity. And all eyes turned to Mikal Mahdi, the man chosen to face the rifles. By 2025, Mahdi's time had run out. His appeals exhausted, his execution was set, and he would be the first to face the rifles in 15 years. April 2025, Columbia, South Carolina. As the sun rose that morning, Mahdi sat alone in his cell, the gray concrete pressing in on him. Guards noted how he paced restlessly, at times scribbling furiously in short notes to his family, at times staring blankly at the wall. He refused the offer of a special last meal. No steak, no dessert. Instead, nibbling at the bland prison food as if to show he would not give the system the satisfaction of a request. He never once apologized to the victims. Witnesses later said his demeanor was cold, even defiant, as though daring the state to finish what it had started 2 decades earlier. By nightfall, the air around the prison was heavy, charged with anticipation. The execution chamber he entered was nothing like the sterile gurney rooms seen in lethal injections. This was a stage built for a grim spectacle. A heavy wooden chair sat bolted to the floor, sandbags stacked to catch stray bullets, and a black cloth backdrop looming behind. The scene looked medieval, as though pulled from another century. Mahdi was strapped into the chair, leather restraints biting into his arms and legs. A hood was pulled over his head, suffocating the last of the light. And then came the final humiliation. A white target pinned directly over his heart, marking the spot where the rifles would strike. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel too loud. The warden's voice broke it with a single command. At exactly 7 p.m., the order was given, and 3 correctional officers armed with Winchester .30-30 rifles took aim from behind a curtained partition. One of the rifles was loaded with a blank so that no man would know who fired the fatal shot. The crack of gunfire reverberated off the walls as the bullets tore through the target on Mahdi's chest. His body snapped forward against the restraints, the hood jerking with the force of impact. Witnesses swore they heard him let out a muffled cry, followed by a sharp, desperate gasp as his breathing turned ragged. Blood blossomed across his shirt in a vivid stain, spreading outward from the white target pinned to his heart. For nearly a full minute, his body twitched and convulsed, the chair rattling against the floor before he slumped forward, lifeless. It wasn't instant, it wasn't clean. It was a drawn-out, brutal end that left even hardened observers shaken. The execution shocked the nation. Journalists and witnesses described it as barbaric. Human rights groups condemned it as torture. Even some lawmakers called for the firing squad to be abolished once again. But others defended it, saying Mahdi had shown no mercy to Officer Myers and deserved none in return. For the victim's family, the execution brought a measure of closure, but also new wounds, forced to relive the night their loved one was murdered. In the end, Mikal Mahdi's death wasn't just the end of a killer. It was the revival of one of America's darkest, most controversial execution methods. What do you think? Was the firing squad a just punishment for Mikal Mahdi, or a barbaric return to the past? Subscribe to Death Row Stories for more shocking final hours, infamous last words, and the real stories behind the world's most controversial executions.